These tempers of assholes.
Season 2, episode 8 of Severance. Short but sweet, just like the sweet vitriol. And we got a lot of good gems in this episode. Now, to get right into the biggest reveal of this episode, Miss Cobel created the Severance chip. Now, if you've already been watching the videos on this channel, you would know that we actually talked about that on this channel already. We talked about how Mrs. Cobelvig, there was just something off about her character. I talked about how she was way too invested in the severance procedure to just be a manager of a severed floor. I told you guys that it was giving she was more involved in the actual creation of the severance chip, and ding ding ding, what happened in this episode. So if you want the best severance breakdowns according to my comments, and you don't want to miss any details that no one else is talking about, and you want to make sure that you caught everything you need to catch in these episodes, hit that subscribe button, like this video, help me hit the algorithm, and let's talk about it. Now, some questions I still have leading into this episode is, number one, we all know now that all the files have been places. We've been talking about that for a while on this channel, but now more and more people are starting to realize that every single file we've seen is named after a place. I talked about in my last video, we don't know really what the actual intent behind all these places is. What do they all actually have in common? Well, we have figured out that every single one of the places mentioned in these files is by a body of water. So now with this new leading theory, you guys can tell me what you guys think in the comments. But with Lumon, the water logo we've seen a million times at this point, what is the need for water? Why is water so important to whatever's going on at Lumon? Now, there's one more detail about water, and that comes from the actual intro to the show that we've been seeing outside of in this very episode, which I believe this is the reason why. I've been telling you guys multiple videos ago that the car in the intro that is in the water is not Gemma's. Gemma never drowned. She did not crash into water. She crashed into a tree. However, the car from the intro looked very familiar, and that it was Mrs. Cobel's car. Now, what else do we see in this very episode? That looks very familiar, doesn't it? It is the water from Salt's Neck. The intro scene with the car in the water is Mrs. Cobel's car in the water of Salt's Neck. Now, this could just be symbolic of what we saw happen in this episode, and does not necessarily mean that we will be losing Miss Cobel in the future, especially now that her car has been left in Salt's Neck. But I do want to point out that all of that came to fruition. It was indeed Mrs. Cobel's car. This is the water from Salt's Neck, and all of that had to do with Mrs. Cobel, not Gemma. Now, in this old town called Salt's Neck, we would know from previous episodes that this is where Lumon started. And we now know this is also where the Ether Factory existed. Now, I want to point out that later on in this episode, what is actually Miss Cobel's aunt, her mother's sister named Sissy, tells us that there was no town before the factory. So keep that in mind, that this town was actually started for the factory, and this plays a role in the rest of what we see in this episode. Now, when it comes to the Ether Factory, the name of the episode tells us everything we need to know. Sweet vitriol is also known as something called diethyl ether. Now, I want to point out that Dieter Eagan, diethyl ether, maybe something there, maybe not, I don't know. But either way, the ether that was being produced at the Ether Factory for Lumon and Lumon's ether is diethyl ether, aka laughing gas. So that would make more sense to you guys later on in the episode when we see Mrs. Cobel and her ex-boyfriend hit a little bit of this ether. They start laughing, they get giddy. This plays into what the ether actually is as the original cure for the human condition, or the cure for humankind, as we see on the barn in Salt's Neck. On this barn, it says, cure Eagan's Lumon ether. There is a miracle cure for mankind. So going back to what Helena said episodes and episodes ago about how since the foundation of Lumon, there have always been people against it. It's always been something that was looked down upon by majority of the public. That was because it was always started as this weird cure for the human condition. And what we've talked about in my last videos is what the human condition actually is. And Lumon's goal was always to cure humanity of ever having to go through anything, including birth and death. All of this placed together. If you want a more in-depth concept on all of these things that Lumon is trying to do, go watch my past videos. Working at this ether mill made many, many workers sick due to the exposure to the chemical ether. I believe that actually has a lot more to do with what actually happened to Miss Cobel's mother. She was the one who coughed up a lung after being at the Lumon ether factory for so long. She raised her kids here in Salt's Neck during that original process of what Lumon was, when Lumon was simply just an ether company. Many of the people in this town were not only building their homes and the full infrastructure of this town around this ether factory, but the whole town was founded for it. So therefore, I believe Mrs. Cobel's mother was actually a worker at this said factory, at the ether factory, and that is what led to her illness. All of these people who used to work at this factory turned out to be sick from the exposure to the chemicals. But there's one other detail I think no one else is talking about that answers huge questions you might have had this whole time. Did anyone else notice how every single person in this town had blue eyes? I believe that this is either because they were exposed to the ether before they were given birth to. Therefore, the ether presented itself in them as a genetic mutation where everyone had these bluish green, very bright eyes. That is not a coincidence. What else have we seen blue eyes? Go back to Mr. Milchek when they painted him, but with blue eyes. All of these things could be connected. This blue eye ideology has something to do with what is going on at Lumon and what they think is a path towards curing the human condition. And I believe that this will all come back later on. But peep how everyone had blue eyes. This could also be a way to denote later on us recognizing someone maybe at Lumon in Kier who comes from Salt's Neck. So keep that in mind as well. And as we start to learn more and more, we find out that at a very, very, very young age, like probably since they could work, some of these children in Salt's Neck were literally doing child labor at the ether factory, including Miss Cobel and all of her friends. Everyone we see in the Drippy Pot Cafe at the beginning were all child labor workers at the time when the ether factory was still open and still operating. That is why at the end of the episode, Sissy calls him a blighted snuff slave. She's literally calling him a slave to the factory, right? That is why when Mrs. Cobel says, I haven't done this since I was 8, because him and her were doing this at the factory. All of these children were literally getting high and then going to work, quote unquote, to man the vat for 10 hours. It was horrendous conditions, clearly, where these kids were suffering greatly from child labor, as well as being exposed to chemicals that they later on seem to have all gotten addicted to, as well as everyone else here in this town. This ether, this laughing gas that they're all getting high off of. And before we talk about the rest of what we learn in this episode, I want to point out that ether, laughing gas, robots, goat consciousnesses, chips, medications, and the final, what I believe Cold Harbor actually is, are all just reiterations of different attempts at what you could do to quote unquote cure humankind, to fix the human condition, to fix mortality, to fix sadness, pain, ever having to go through anything, ever having to do anything, ever having the mundanity of work, of the dentist, of life. That is what Lumon is trying to accomplish, and that will be accomplished in their minds with this final attempt with Cold Harbor. Now, they talk about how Sissy still lives by the 9 core Lumen principles, and therefore she's become a pariah to the town because the whole town has either left or completely turned on Lumen, which is a natural reaction to literally being abandoned, because once Lumen moved on and they found new tech, when they found the chip, they no longer had a need for the actual ether. This all plays a role, and that is why he is so upset when Mrs. Cobel comes home, because she is in some ways the reason the town no longer exists, because Lumen no longer needed the ether. Obviously, there's good reasons and bad reasons that there would no longer be child labor, right? But either way, all of these people lost their homes and they lost their livelihoods when Lumen figured out a new way to cure humankind. Now, as we get deeper into all the things we see throughout this episode, it'll help you put some timestamps on what we actually are seeing in the history of the Severance trip, Lumen and Mrs. Cobel. Starting with number 1, the height measurements on the wall when she finally does come home. She hasn't been home since she was 12. That's why 12 is the last number on the wall. Now, as she walks by these Lumen Ether plaques, again, not Lumen Industries, Lumen Ether, it talks about how a quarterly striver, which I believe means striving for greatness, and in the 4th quarter of the year of vision, which is one of, and actually the first of the 9 core principles, there was a youth apprentice mentor, which meant that she was basically the manager of these groups of children who were working at Lumen at the time. And her name was Celestine Sissy Cobel, Harmony's aunt, Harmony Cobel's mother's sister. But with this youth apprentice mentor and this mentorship, right, she was the one who was controlling all of these kids, keeping them in check, probably the one that instilled a lot of these beliefs about Lumen on them, and was an operating general of what I've been calling for a very long time in all of my videos, the Lumen religious cult. And that brings us to the shrine. Now, on this shrine, there's a lot of things you can look at that are very detailed illustrations of different ways you can express religion. A lot of these things are just simply examples that they've used and utilized to compare this religious cult of Lumen to actual religious cults in actual religions. Again, nothing being pictured is saying that any particular real religion is a cult, right? But all of these things are symbolic of the things you would care about and you would have if you were indoctrinated into certain types of religions and cults, similar to the one that is being made up for this show. Now, also on this wall is an article that literally says James Eagan becomes CEO. This will be important later on. There's another article that says the open door, the Lumen industry miracle. So again, this is very much clearly the first thing that they came up with, the thing that led them to closing the ether factory. Now, we see another piece of paper called the work-life balance, which is something we've seen talked about earlier in earlier seasons of why you would get severed to be a worker, because you would no longer have to think about or know even what you even did at work. You wouldn't have to man those hours, do the mundanity of having to go to work just to get paid. You would actually not even remember you were even at work. Another way that they've pitched the severance chip itself. Now, we also see the 9 principles cards and the 4 tempers on the wall. Now, I want to point out that a lot of people believe that they know which one of the 4 tempers is which, but I believe based off of the way that these models look, we have always been wrong. Me personally, I never thought the goat was Malice, but this only further confirms it for me personally. I believe the goat is Frolic. Woe is the bride, because that's what we learned from the 4th appendix. And Malice could be the jester and Dread could be the old woman. Now, between the jester and the old woman, it could be flipped. However, I believe Frolic is the goat and Woe is the bride. Let me know what you guys think. Now, after Mrs. Cobel finds the key to her mother's room, goes into her mother's room, and we see her take in all these years that have passed since her mother has passed. As you see, the clothes are completely falling apart. This room has not been touched, and everything is almost as it was since her mother was in there. She falls asleep in there and wakes up to finally realize what she's looking for is probably not in there. To skip ahead, because again, we've all watched the same episode, so I'm going to stick to the details you need to have caught and you may have missed. Let's skip ahead to the big plot twist. As Mrs. Cobel is going through what seems to be an outdoor shed connected to the house, we see that she finds a yearbook called the Annual Reminiscence. We see that she was the valedictorian of her school, as well as named the Wintertide Fellow. We've seen this Wintertide word be brought up before, bringing up Mr. Milchick again when he was talking to Mrs. Wong, and he said, "You will not move on until I have deemed you Wintertide material." So this Wintertide word is very clearly linked to what it means to be a child prodigy, something that Lumon has deemed worthy of the Wintertide title. And before we get too far into it, I want you to remember this concept of prodigal child and why this might be related to Helena as well as James Eagan. Now, in this actual yearbook, Annual Reminiscence, we see them talk about during a special ceremony, James Eagan presented Harmony Cobel with the prestigious Wintertide Fellowship. Harmony Cobel's outstanding dedication to the 9 core values has earned her the distinguished honor of being named the Year of Wiles Wintertide Fellow. I want to point out that the year of vision being the very first principle of 9, and the year of wiles being the last principle of 9 in order. Therefore, it's safe to believe since Mrs. Cobel left home at 12, she was at the Wintertide Fellowship for 9 years, graduating at the age of 21. Now, as this paragraph continues to go on, it says this achievement not only acknowledges Harmony's exceptional academic pursuits, but also recognizes her as the embodiment of the Eagan principles that form the foundation of the culture. And I believe it goes on to say the culture of the 9. Now, I want to point out in this particular image that James Eagan looks very young. He almost looks like he's the same age as Mrs. Cobel in some ways, at least very close. And he was the founder of this Wintertide Fellowship. I believe this is because he has a very similar story to like we're almost seeing play out with Helena. Now, rewind with me and think about real life situations. It's hard to relate to billionaires, I know. But think about a lot of the story tropes we see happen around the children of rich people, Nepo babies, for example, and how we time and time again see a storyline which actually plays out in real life where the child of these prestigious, well-accomplished people who have made so much money off of a company struggle to find their place in said company, and at a very young age maybe even rebel against this said company, right? But even the ones who kind of fit in, they're trying to find their way, although they might not actually be as accomplished or actually have the credentials to be a true predecessor. Well, in some ways, this has played out in the past of a company giving their child something else to do, a offshoot, for say, of a company that may have or may not have a lot of importance. I believe this fellowship was James Eagan being given this said offshoot. He looks too young to be in charge of anything, right? And there might be a huge storyline or a backstory on potentially him not being the type of predecessor that the previous CEO was actually looking for. Think about how he calls Helena a fetid moppet, but what if he was one too? Because that's usually how that plays out. He founded this fellowship when he was super young and realized he had a student like Mrs. Cobel who could actually usher in something completely new, something groundbreaking like a Severance chip. And that is why he took credit for the chip, because he himself alone as James Eagan was the fetid moppet. He was the child of the previous CEO who had not accomplished anything or built the credentials to become the next CEO until the Severance chip, and ushered in a completely new era at Lumon, ending the era of the ether mill. And this could also be what ushered James in as CEO in 2003. So all of these things are connected. That is his story. And at the end of the day, we now know that Mrs. Cobel created it all. She knows all of the science, all of the tech, how it works. She created it. And now she will also probably be the one to destroy it. And I love how they flipped her character on her head. She seemed like this overly loyal religious cult worshiper who had no sense of reality and just was simply loyal to the Eagans and to Lumon. And for us to watch her own downfall when she realized that all of it meant nothing, because at the end of the day, Lumon thought she was replaceable, even though they would not even be Lumon without her tech. Didn't matter. And that's when she realized it didn't matter. That day she left and she ran from Helly and the security guard was because she knew that they were the type of company who could probably, get rid of her and nobody would think otherwise. They've probably done it before, like we've heard about in the Lexington letter. Now that we've talked completely about this episode, let's talk about Cold Harbor, because now that I've had some time to sit with my findings from the last episode, that all of the details, if you guys missed in episode 7, I really would tell anyone who has not watched that video to go watch it, because I went really in depth on some of the biggest things that could be telling us what's happening in this show. And I want to talk about even more about Cold Harbor, because now this part of it also starts to make sense. Now that we've seen that ether itself, the original product of Lumon, was always to cure humanity. And I've talked about how curing humanity has always been at the center point of what is going on at Lumon. I think a lot of people are jumping to that just means bringing in immortality as a potential thing. But I believe everything we saw in the last episode, immortality and mortality seem to be more the tip of the iceberg than it is the actual point, the actual thing that they're trying to cure, right? Because mortality is only a part of the human condition, and they're trying to cure the human condition, a cure for humankind. And I believe a cure for humankind is not just making people immortal, but it's making people perfect while they're alive, making people not have to go through sadness, pain, trauma, mundane tasks, not having to deal with anything, and just living a life that is carefree and doing the things that they're supposed to do. Being the perfect worker, the perfect CEO, the perfect human, the most agreeable human, the most agreeable man. All things that were playing out in the last episode. That is what they're truly trying to accomplish, because at the end of the day, all of this cure for humankind is actually just a psyop for what they're actually trying to do, which is create a slave human race for Lumon. That Lumon would control everything. They would become these false gods that they have very clearly tried to create for themselves inside of Lumon. That's the point of the Perpetuity Wing. That's the point of the Compliance Handbook. The point of all the paintings that make Kier this leader that everyone needs to follow. The real reason they're curing humankind is to have a slave race to the Eagans, right? And to make the perfect people by taming tempers, because people who are tame do not rebel. People who are tame do not think. People who are tame act like children and do not want to understand anything that's going around them, and they're easy to control. That's the whole point of everything we're watching in Severance. So how does this relate to Cold Harbor? The actual crib that Mark gives Gemma says on it, Cold Harbor. This is a crazy detail that I can't believe all of us missed, including myself. And thanks to this person on TikTok, I now understand that that has even more to do with my theory I already talked about in my last video, which I'm going to talk about now. All of these different instances of Lumon trying to cure humankind have led to the final attempt, the biggest attempt, the most important attempt, according to Drummond, would change human history attempt. We've seen the robots, we've seen the ether, we've seen the chips, we've seen them using chemicals to tame the tempers, we've seen them using psychological things to tame the tempers, right? We've seen the goats now, because I believe that was an attempt to see that if they turned humans into goats, are human goats the perfect human organism, right? Clearly they're not. Shout out to Rickon. But what would be the last and final attempt, and how would this all connect to Gemma? We talked about in my last video that Gemma went through IVF. This is central to why they have Gemma. This is not just a side piece or a side quest. They went specifically after a woman who would need IVF for a reason. They're creating cards that look like all the Chick-I Bardo cards, the ones that Gemma was sent, for a reason. They were working through this fertility clinic for a reason. Gemma and Cold Harbor are going to be an attempt at giving birth to a human being who is born with their tempers tamed. The perfect human organism that never even knew what the tempers were. They already don't exist within this human body. And therefore, this person, through the concept of Chick-I Bardo and taming the temper, similar to a person who meditates, would then accomplish immortality through this process. That is what Cold Harbor is. Cold Harbor will be their attempt at creating a child who already has the tempers tamed. I believe Gemma will be impregnated through this process because that was the whole point of taming Gemma's tempers, is that a mother whose tempers have been tamed through all of these refining procedures will then give birth to a child whose tempers are born tamed. I believe that is where this is going. Similar to how a mother who was exposed to either, like Mrs. Cobel's mother, would give birth to a child with blue eyes. It's all connected, right? However, when it comes to Helena, and the potential that Mark will also father a child with Helly and Helena, I believe this will be a secondary child who they will then go on to try to have the same process happen with. And this might be central to why Helena wanted to have sex with Mark and why Helly has this internal drive and desire to be with Mark, because her outie, Helena, understands that this is what is happening, and knowing that he will be the father of this project means that why not make him the father of my actual kids, the father of the future CEOs who will also be born with their tempers tamed. That part might be a reach. But as far as everything else I've said about Gemma, the IVF, Cold Harbor, and everything else leading up to that, that is what is going on. And I wanted to say it in this video, particularly much more clear for you guys. That way you guys would know that this has been my theory for a while now, and that I'm so glad to see some of these things play out. Again, I could be wrong. Again, anything anyone else has said could be right. I could be wrong. That just is what it is. This channel would not be fun to have if I was always right. But with that being said, I hope you guys liked this video. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit that like button for me. Comment down below anything else you would like me to talk about when it comes to Severance before these last 2 episodes. We have 2 episodes left. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in my next video.